Chapter 3. Still May 24th. Now it is night, and he is in my house. Or possibly not in it, just outside it, in a small plastic tent he put up. I cannot be sure because it is too dark to see clearly. I am watching from the cave, but the fire he built outside the house in the yard has burned down. He built it with my wood. He came over the top of Burden Hill this afternoon. I was back up to watch, having eaten some lunch and changed back into my blue jeans. I decided not to show myself. I can always change my mind later. I wondered what he would do when he reached the top. He must have been pretty sure, but not quite, that he was coming to a place where things were living. As I said, you can see the green from the ridge, but not too well. It is a long way. And maybe he has been fooled sometimes. Maybe he thought it was a mirage. There is a flat piece where the road first reaches the top of the hill, a stretch of about 100 yards or so before it keeps descending again, into the valley. When you get past the middle of this, you can see it all, the river, the house, the barn, the trees, pasture, everything. It was my favorite sight when I had been away, maybe because when I saw it, it was always coming home. As it's spring today, it is all a new, fresh green. When he got to that place, he stopped. He dropped the shaft of the wagon and just stared for almost a minute. Then he ran forward down the road, very clumsily in his plastic suit, waving his arms. He ran to a tree by the roadside and pulled a branch, tearing off the leaves and holding them close to his glass face mask. You could tell he was thinking, "Are they real?" I was watching from a place only a little way up the hillside, the path in the woods. I had my gun beside me. I did not know whether he could hear or not with the mask on, but I did not move or make a sound. All at once he pulled at the mask, at a fastening at the neck of it, as if he was going to take it off. So far, I had not been able to see his face at all, but only the glass plate, so I was staring. Then he stopped, and instead ran back to the wagon. He unsnapped the plastic cover from one end of the trunk and pulled it open. He reached inside and took out a glass thing, a sort of tube with a metal rod on it, like a big thermometer. It had some kind of a dial or a gauge on it to read. I couldn't see from where I was, but he held it in front of his mask and turned it slowly, studying it. He walked back down the road to the tree, looking at the rod. He held it down close to the blacktop, then high in the air, then back to the wagon again. He took out another machine, something like the first one but bigger. After that, he pulled out a black, round thing. It was an earphone with a wire dangling from it. He plugged the wire into the machine and put the earphone up beside his mask, next to his ear. I could tell what he was thinking, using one machine to check against the other. And I knew what they must be. I had read about them, but never seen one. Radiation counters. Geiger counters, they call them. He walked down the road, a long way this time, half a mile at least, watching one counter, listening to the other. Then he took off the mask and shouted. It startled me so that I jumped back. I started to run, then I stopped. He was not shouting at me. He was cheering, a long, "Hey!" sound, the kind they make at football games. He didn't hear me, luckily. The shout went echoing down the valley, and I stood absolutely still again, though my heart was still thumping. It was so long since I had heard any voice except my own, when I sing sometimes. He was answered by silence, so he put his hands beside his mouth and shouted again, aiming down the hill. This time he called very loud, "Anybody there?" It echoed again. When it stopped, it was strange how much quieter it seemed than before. You get so used to silence you don't notice it, but the sound of his voice was a nice, strong sound. For a minute, I almost changed my mind. It came on me in a rush, very strong. I wanted to run down the hill through the woods and call, "I'm here!" I wanted to cry, to touch his face, but I caught myself in time and stayed quiet. He turned, and I looked through my binoculars watching him. He was walking back to the wagon, with his mask hanging down his back like a hood. He had a beard, and his hair was long and dark brown. What I noticed most, though, was that he was extremely pale. I must have gotten used to the tan color of my own hands and arms, but I've seen pictures of coal miners who work all day underground. He looked like that. His face, as well as I could see it, was narrow and long, with quite a big nose. With the long hair, the beard, and the pale white color, he looked quite wild, but also, I have to admit, rather poetic, and not very healthy. He came back to the wagon, looking over his shoulder a lot, in the direction of my house. I suppose he was thinking, there might be someone there. They could hardly hear from here. He was right. It is nearly a mile from the hilltop to the house. He put one of the machines back into the trunk, and then he did a surprising thing. He took out a gun and laid it on top of the plastic cover as if he wanted it handy. He kept the other counter out too, the one with the earphone. Finally, he picked up the shaft of the wagon and started down the hill. When the slope got steep, he turned the wagon around, so it went ahead and he was pulling back on it. Every 50 feet or so, he would turn it sideways, stop, and listen to the earphone. Twice more, too, he called. Moving as slowly as he did, it was about 5 o'clock by my watch when he reached the bottom of the hill, and dusk before he got to the house. I went back along the high path to the cave, where I am now, and watched him through the binoculars. When he got to the house, he put down the wagon shaft in the front yard. I am glad now that I did not have time to mow it. I decided last summer that I wouldn't even try, so the grass is knee-high and a lot of weeds have sprung up. Then he began to act in a strange way, to move with great caution. Instead of going to the door, he walked around the house and looked in every window. He stayed back as if he was afraid or did not want to be seen. Finally, he went to the door and called again, the same words as before. "Anybody here?" This time he said it more quietly, as if he knew somehow that he was not going to get an answer. He had been through it before, without knocking. He opened the door and went in. Then I was nervous. Had I left anything? A half bucket of fresh water? An egg on the shelf? A lot of things went through my head. Any one of them, would give me away, but I didn't think I had. About 20 minutes later he came out, looking a little bit puzzled. He stood in front of the doorway, staring at the road, thinking. He started toward it, and then apparently changed his mind. I think he was considering going to the church and the store. You can't see them from the house, but he had seen them both, of course, from the top of the hill. So he knew about where they were. Anyway, he looked at the sky instead. The sun had set and it was getting dark, so he came back to his wagon and opened its plastic cover. This time he pulled several things from it, including a bulky square which he unfolded and set up. The tent. He had obviously looked out the kitchen window and seen the woodshed because when the tent was ready, he walked around the house and got some wood to build his fire. After he got it going, he took some more stuff from the wagon. I could not see very well in the firelight. It had grown completely dark, but I could tell he was cooking a meal of some kind. When he had eaten, he sat by the fire for a long time while it slowly died down. Then, as I said, I couldn't see much, but I think he got into the tent. Now I think he is asleep. He could have slept in the house, but I suppose he didn't trust it. I think that green plastic stuff, the suit, the tent, the wagon cover, is something that stops radiation. I will go in the cave now and sleep. I am still afraid, and yet it is... What is the word I mean? Companionable? To know there is someone else in the valley. May 25th. It may be that he made a mistake. I'm not sure. And if it was a mistake, I don't know how bad. It worries me because I could have stopped him, though I don't know how, not without showing myself. When I came out of the cave this morning, very carefully on hands and knees, keeping my head down, he was already awake, though the sun was barely up. He was folding his tent. He put it back in the wagon, and then several things happened very quickly. First, somewhere out behind the chicken yard, one of the hens cackled. It had laid an egg, of course. Almost immediately a rooster crowed, and from the distance, as if it were answering, one of the cows mooed, a real bellow, long and loud. He dropped a pan he was holding and jumped up, listening. He looked amazed, as if he could not believe it. He probably had not heard an animal sound for more than a year. He stood there for a minute, just listening, staring and thinking. After that he got quite busy. He pulled out his radiation counter again, the small one, and looked at it. He was still wearing his plastic suit, though without the helmet. Now he pulled at some kind of fastening on the cuffs and removed the glove parts that had covered his hands. He reached farther into his wagon trunk and took out another gun, a big one. It looked like an army gun. A carbine, I think, with a square magazine sticking out of the bottom. He looked at it but put it back and got the smaller gun from the tent. The other was a .22 like mine, only bolt action, and mine is a pump. He carried it toward the chicken yard. The chickens weren't in the chicken yard, of course, because I had shut the gate when I chased them out. But some of them, at least, had stayed around it. I knew they would because that's where I'd fed them. I couldn't see his back anymore, or him back there, because there are some big bushes, lilac and forsythia, between the house and the fence. But in a minute I heard the rifle crack, and a couple of minutes after he came back, carrying a dead chicken. One of my chickens. I could hardly blame him, of course. I don't know what kind of food he carries in that wagon, but whatever it is, I'm sure there is no fresh meat, or fresh anything. So I can understand how the thought of a chicken would make him hungry. In a few days I expect I'll be feeling the same way. But shooting is not the accepted method of killing a tame chicken. I eat them myself, as we always did, but I have not yet fired a shot from any of my guns, not once since before the war. He put the chicken down on top of the wagon, and then, without waiting to pluck or clean it, started out immediately down the road in the direction of the church and the store, and the cows. He took the smaller rifle with him, also the glass tube. From this first day, at least, I thought I had better keep him in sight as much as I could until I get to know something about his habits. So again I went along a path I know in the woods, about 2/3 of the way up the hillside. That way I could watch him closer up, better than from the cave, where the road disappears for stretches where trees grow near it. I took my binoculars and my own rifle. He saw the cows right away. As soon as he got past the barn and the fence, they were off by the pond, in the far field. My father used to grow oats there, but luckily the last spring he had rotated it to fescue. They were grazing there quietly, with the calf between them. They were not fenced in, but as I had thought they would. They had stayed near home. When he moved towards them, a stranger, they ran off. They're not very far. Cows can tell people apart all right, though it's true they don't care much. He started to follow them, then changed his mind and walked to the edge of the pond. He stared into the water, first from a few feet away, then, obviously very interested, kneeling down with his face close to the surface. I could tell he was looking at the minnows. There are always some up near the edge. He took his glass counter and held it close to the water. Finally, he stuck one end of it in the water. He put out his hand, cupped some of it, and tested it. It tastes fine, I know. I drink it all the time. Though I get it from the brook at the other end. I could tell he felt like cheering. He went on to the church, where he stayed a few minutes. To the store, where he stayed much longer. I could tell what he did inside. Examine what was there, I suppose, and check it with his counter. When he came out, he was carrying a box of something. Canned stuff, I thought. That's as far as he walked. From the store, he headed back towards the house. With the box, the rifle, and the counter, he was quite heavily loaded. Once, on the way, he suddenly put the box down, raised the rifle, and fired into some bushes by the edge of the road. He probably saw a rabbit. There are quite a few in the valley, also squirrels, and a few crows who seem to have had the sense to stay around. The other birds, moving as they do, flew out into the deadness and died. Apparently he missed the rabbit. It was now nearly 11 o'clock. The sun was high and bright, and the day was turned warm. Wearing that plastic suit and carrying all that stuff, I could tell he was getting too hot. He stopped twice to rest and put the carton down. And that was why, when he got back to the house, he made the mistake. He went swimming and took a bath in the dead stream, Burden Creek. First, he put the carton down on top of the wagon and took things out of it, as I had guessed. Most of it was canned food, but he also took out a couple of bars of soap. I recognized the blue wrappers. Next, to my astonishment, he took off the plastic suit. He simply unzipped it down the front, pulled it down over his legs, and stepped out of it. Underneath, he was wearing what looked like a very thin, lightweight blue coverall. Down the back and arms it was soaked with sweat. After that, having been so cautious up till then, he was careless. I can see how he did it. He thought, not knowing the geography of the valley very well, that it was all the same stream. He did not know that there were two streams, and he had seen the fish. Being so hot, and maybe not having a bath in a long time, he picked up the soap and ran across the road, where he took off the coverall and jumped in with a splash. If he had been a little less eager, he might have noticed that there were no fish there, and that all the grass and weeds were dead for about 2 feet back along both the banks. Quite a few of the trees along the creek are dying too, but he didn't look. He stayed in quite a long time with his piece of soap. I said I don't know how bad a mistake it was. That's because I don't know what is wrong with the water. The stream merges with the other one, the pond stream, farther down the valley, and they flow out the gap as one. Downstream, from where they merge, they are both dead. I have looked many times, thinking that maybe, after all this time, the water from Burden Creek might be all right again. But no fish swims in it, or if it does, it dies and drifts away. It might be that if he had taken his glass rod, he would have found the water is radioactive, but I can't be sure. On the radio at the end of the war, they said the enemy was using nerve gas, bacteria, and other anti-personal weapons. So it could be anything. All I can do is wait and watch. I hope it doesn't kill him.